What did he say? This cup is what? He said it's the new covenant in my blood. And so the covenant is a term drawn from the Hebrew scriptures that tells the story of Yahweh moving forward the kingdom of God, or his mission to redeem and to save in moments by entering into these covenant relationships with his people. He was in a covenant with his people, Israel, that he redeemed out of slavery, but Jesus was looking to the Hebrew prophets who looked forward to a new relationship that God would enter into with his people, and that covenant would be somehow connected to the blood of a new lamb. All of this is swirling together, and Jesus is making all of these ancient symbols have new meaning. He knew that in roughly 12 hours he was about to die, and he knew that he truly believed, and you can see it with what he says with these ancient symbols, that this night and what would follow in the next days was like the turning point. It was a new exodus that was about to take place. And he was the lamb. And this, I hope this has been interesting and fun and kind of cultural history lesson, and that's awesome. That's great. So it's good to learn things and to engage our minds. But if that's all that this is, then we completely miss the point. Because Jesus was convinced, dead convinced, pun intended, right? That what happened in that small room, that quiet night, that last meal, that was an event of significance for all humanity, all places, all times. Something was about to happen that would mean an exodus, a freedom from slavery, not just for his tribe, the Israelites, but for the whole world. So think about what Jesus is doing here. If we kind of float above the meaning of Passover and the story of the Exodus, it's a story that moves in three kind of moments, or has three key components of the story. So think about it this way, right? So you have through the lamb. The lamb is the key. Can you see this up here? You'll see it up here on the screen. It'll kind of help make sense. So the lamb is the key part of the meal, right? Because it's through the lamb that we are covered, and then redemption comes after the blood of the lamb. It's through the lamb who gets rescued. Israelites, mostly, although anyone could come under the covering of the lamb, and then they are rescued from whom? So big bad king of Egypt, right? Pharaoh. It's Pharaoh. That's the story of the Exodus. And what Jesus does brilliantly, he takes this ancient meal and he wraps it all around himself and what's about to happen, and he uses the same storyline, but he swaps out all the players to give it new meaning. So all of a sudden, it's not through the lamb dying and that they're eating that redemption is going to take place. It's actually through his death. He said his suffering and his death, his body broken, his blood poured out. Jesus saw himself as somehow dying in the place of others. And who would be rescued from Jesus' death? Who would be just Israelites? So no, you read his teachings. He clearly had a vision that his death had meaning and significance for the whole world, for all of humanity. And so the story that Jesus is telling is that through him, the whole world was somehow going to be rescued from slavery to what? To Caesar, like Pontius Pilate, to Rome or something? Just so clearly not. He had another enemy, right? Another Pharaoh in mind, who was much more sinister, much more pervasive and universal in humanity. And so here's what this comes down to. Jesus, he's clearly brilliant, and he's thought all this through. You read his teachings. When Jesus looked out at the world, he didn't see my tribe and your tribe, He didn't see the world in terms of Israelites versus the pagans, or the people whom God is for and the people whom God is against. He didn't see the world that way. And it was scandalous to many people around him, because he's constantly moved towards people who were considered outside of the boundary lines of what's okay for good, religious, observant Jews. And so he moved towards the tax collectors, or the prostitutes, or the lepers, and he was announcing to them that God's kingdom was available and open to them as well. He just saw people, just humans made in God's image. And if you read his teachings, like you read the Sermon on the Mount, for example, Jesus, he knew that the human heart is an extremely complex thing that is sometimes capable of bringing out great beauty and goodness, which should be celebrated, but he also knew that the human heart is enslaved to dark powers and dark things inside of us, things that lead us towards slavery. Right? And so he had this one teaching where he said it's not like somehow you're eating certain types of ritual foods that make you unclean. No, the uncleanness is rooted deep in the human heart. And it's shown by all of the behaviors that we manifest that show just how enslaved we are. Things like bitterness and anger, right? And unforgiveness and lust. These things that show there's something deeply wrong with me. And no one, it's like my little 2-year-old son right now. I absolutely love him to death. Boy, he is selfish. You know what I mean? And I sure didn't teach him that. You know what I mean? Like it's just coming out of him. There are so many wonderful, beautiful things coming out of him too. But dude, he is about himself a lot of the time. You know what I'm saying? And it's just like, no one has to teach us that. It just comes out of us. If we're super honest with ourselves, we know there's something wrong with us. And that something wrong with us manifests itself. It manifests itself in broken relationships and broken families and marriages, which result in neighborhoods and cities and governments that look like ours. And the moment any one of us tries to clean our hands from it and say, I'm glad I'm not like those people, it just shows how incredibly naive we are about the darkness that's really inside of us. You know what I'm saying? And so when Jesus saw the world, he actually believed that Pharaoh is something that resides in every single one of us. We all have Pharaoh inside of us. And so what we really need to be rescued from is not the tyranny of Rome. What Jesus came to do was deal with the slavery of the human heart to these dark powers that have enslaved all of humanity. And so then what Jesus is doing with this meal is he's saying that somehow his life would now be a life lived on behalf of others. And his death would now be like a stand-in to stand in the place of others. He would die so that others could live. He would become the whipped slave so that others could go free. And what we'll celebrate next Sunday is that he would be raised from the dead into new life so that he could give that resurrection life to all who would turn towards him in faith. The Passover meal tells the story of the gospel, is the good news of Jesus who loved us and gave himself for us to free us. And this is the moment where this ancient meal stops being ancient history. It becomes a moment where Jesus confronts every single one of us to own up to the darkness that enslaves us. And it forces a moment, a crisis, a decision of faith. Do you really believe that Jesus can free you from the junk that's inside of you, from the mess and the dark and the brokenness and the sin? It's precisely what he said he came to do. And so every time, there's 4 cups in a Passover meal. The 4th we're all going to take together in our time of worship here. And we do this every single week, but I trust that as we take the bread and the cup, tonight it has a new layer of significance and meaning, because Jesus says when we take this meal together, we're reenacting the story that says he promises liberation and freedom for those who turn to him, freedom from sin and from death. And so I know for a fact, there's some of us who are here tonight and you didn't maybe even didn't want to come or something, and you've fallen again, you've given in again to the darkness inside of you. And it might actually make you feel like it should prevent you from taking the bread and the cup. And that's precisely the opposite of what Jesus wants. The whole point of taking the bread and the cup is that we're not worthy and we don't deserve it. But he's come to free us anyway. And so, man, don't miss out on this chance to take the bread and the cup as we go into Holy Week here together and march towards Resurrection Sunday.